This video was supposed to be a footnote for the previous video on Super Mario Bros. Glitch levels, but then I decided to answer a lot of the questions asked in the comments, and whoops, the video turned out to be 25 minutes long. I'll go into more depth about some of the intricacies of the level format, as well as talk about other releases of the game and what changed between versions. Okay, the first thing I want to show is a few animations of the glitch levels being played, with all the level data information displayed. I only showed 1-1 in the last video, and in an unlisted video, I showed all of the other normal levels in the game. But I didn't show any glitch levels, which I regret missing out on. So here's 3 of them. First is the level with ID hex 50, the Cloud Tunnel level. Garbage level data means that nonsense objects are being placed all over. And since there's no guarantee that these objects are in order horizontally, a lot of them don't load at all. It's also worth pointing out that sprites don't have a queue system at all, and will just always be placed as long as there aren't more than 4 sprites already loaded, and that they are placed in the loading zone just off the right side of the screen. Otherwise, they just get skipped over. Next is the level with ID hex 58, the tunnel that crashes. The sprite data pointer for this level points to a region of memory that just doesn't exist on the NES without a fancier ROM mapper, so it gets stuck trying to load the same Koopa 5 times every frame at position 00 in the level. I'll talk about why this level crashes in just a moment. But first, here's the level with ID hex 68, the auto-scroller. This is the castle version of the level with ID hex 4B that I showed in the previous video. You can't get to this level through the tennis glitch. Its sprite pointer is just that of level 4-1, which is why the Lakitu is here. There's a handful of objects that just don't load here due to them being out of order. Essentially, the number of skipped objects is random, since once the X position of an object is out of order, you have to hope you run into a byte that has the next screen flag set in order to continue with other objects. I sort of mentioned this in the previous video, but I'll clarify here. The level data, for the objects and sprites separately, cannot exceed 256 bytes. This limits you to 128 tile objects and up to 128 sprite objects, or fewer depending on the number of level transition objects, which take up 3 bytes. In fact, if you don't hit the end of the level data within the 256 bytes, the level will just repeat those 256 bytes of data forever. This is because the level data is indexed with the Y register, which is only 8 bits long. If you reach the end of the level data, when the register is incremented, it just rolls back over to 0 and the data repeats again. All tile objects are 2 bytes long, so this will repeat after 128 objects. But for sprites, some weird stuff can happen due to the level transition objects, which sort of switches the parity of the index from odd to even, or vice versa, every time one is loaded. Why does the game crash sometimes? When an object is loaded, generally the game loads the index of the object, what I referred to as the object's type number, and uses it as an index into a jump table. That is, there is a list of pointers to routines in the code that are responsible for initializing each type of object. For example, the standard tile objects have type numbers ranging from 0 to 11. This means there is a jump table consisting of 12 pointers, one for each of these objects. There are 4 kinds of outcomes when one of these pointers is loaded and jumped to. The first of which is the intended outcome, where the proper pointer is taken and the object loads as it should. The other 3 outcomes have to do when the type number of the object is not any value that was intended to be used. If you were to load object with type 12, then the 13th pointer in this list would be loaded. Jumping to a pointer out of bounds like this can cause some weird stuff. In this particular case though, right after this jump table in the ROM is another jump table for the tile objects with Y position 13. This is why an L-shaped pipe loads when using standard object number 12, or Y position 13 object number 0. It's because the jump tables overlap. However, if there doesn't happen to be another jump table at the end, then the game can just crash, since it will be jumping to a location in memory that doesn't necessarily hold executable code. The fourth outcome is that an object is just explicitly told to do nothing, sort of like a placeholder, in which the game doesn't crash. A handful of sprite objects are like this, resulting in duplicate and odd-acting enemies, such as a Koopa Paratroopa that flies in place without moving. How do you get 5 tile objects in one column? This is what this video was originally going to be about. First, one quick thing about the object queue. Newly loaded objects are always put into the lowest available slot, and are removed when they have been completely drawn to the screen. They stick around in the queue if they are only partially loaded in so far, which happens for any object that takes up more than one column of tiles. Objects in the queue are drawn to the screen in the order of lowest to highest slot, and higher slotted objects will overwrite lower slotted objects. For example, say you wanted to put some question blocks inside a big long row of brick blocks. This only works if the bricks are in a lower slot than the question blocks. Otherwise, the bricks will just overwrite the question blocks right away, and you won't be able to see them. There are some exceptions, like the stems for the tree and mushroom platforms, which never overwrite certain tiles, to make it easier to place these objects properly in a level. But now the 5 objects in a column thing. Recall that when the third slot in the queue gets filled, the game immediately processes objects, regardless if there are more objects on this column. When the game is skipping forward to the next screen after already been locked up on the previous screen, every object it skips sort of temporarily enters the queue. It doesn't actually enter the queue. The slot acts as if it were filled, since skipping over objects like this messes up how the game determines which queue slots are currently empty. And if one of these skipped objects happens to fill the third slot, any of the objects that are actually in the queue get processed immediately without actually advancing to the next column. At this point, the queue slots that were temporarily filled by those skipped objects become truly empty again, and this repeats until the game finds an object with that next screen flag set. This phenomenon does not occur if the third slot in the queue is already filled with an actual object. If it is filled, then things behave as you would expect. A side effect of this process is that objects that span across the screen boundary actually shrink by 1 tile every time the column is pre-processed. The game keeps track of how many columns there are left to go for each object, and every time the queue is processed, each object's width is decremented by 1. This corresponds to advancing to the next column, as you would expect. However, when the queue is pre-processed like this, we don't advance to the next column, but the object widths are still decremented anyway. Every time this column is processed, it will overwrite whatever it wrote in the previous processing steps. Additionally, if an object reaches a width remaining of 0 during the pre-processing step, it will actually exit the queue, which is exactly how to get 5 objects in one column. Here's an easy way to get those 5 objects in one column. Place 2 objects that span over the screen boundary and make sure they end up in queue slots 1 and 2. Place a third dummy object with an X position less than the previous objects, which will lock up the level loading routine. Then, place more objects on this screen as necessary. You will need as many objects as there will be empty queue slots while pre-processing the first 2 objects. This will ensure that those 2 objects get completely drawn and exit the queue during the pre-processing step. If these objects only cross over by 1 tile, you only need the 1 dummy object. Then, the next 3 objects need to be placed at X position 0 of the next screen, one of which with the next screen flag, of course. This will cause the first 2 objects and the last 3 objects to all be processed on this specific column. It's very convoluted, but a neat trick if you were to want to make a ROM hack of the game without putting in too much effort of modifying the game's code. How does the minus world work? There's a great video by Displaced Gamers that explains why the minus world happens in the first place, which I will link in the video description. But long story short, there are 3 warp zones, one for worlds 2, 3, and 4, one for just world 5, and one for worlds 6, 7, and 8. These world numbers also dictate which tile is drawn above the pipes when Mario enters the warp zone, and since there is only one pipe in the second warp zone, the left and right pipes, which are non-existent, use ID hex 24, a blank tile. So theoretically, if there was a pipe on the left and right in 4-2, they would go to world 36, hex 24 in decimal. And it turns out, due to a weird bug/inconsistency, that the default warp zone, if the text hasn't been triggered yet, is the second one with only one pipe. So if you enter the left pipe in level 1-2 before the text appears, you would go to world 36. And if you go in the middle pipe, you actually go to world 5. Now if we look at our tables that we made in the previous videos, world 36 would take us to the level with ID 1, which is just level 2-2, or rather, more pedantically, 7-2, since the bloopers with the hard level flag do spawn in this level, since 36-1 comes after 5-3. The pipe at the end doesn't work and just repeats the level, since the level transition objects check for the current world number. There's an object for world 2 and one for world 7, and another for world 3 for some reason, but not one for world 36, so without a transition specified, the level just leads to itself. What about other versions of the game, like the Famicom Disk System released? In the FDS version of Super Mario Bros., not much was changed. However, the memory map of the FDS is much different than that of the original NES, so all of the pointers to level data are different. They still point to the same data, it's just all in a different location, which means that the indices for the glitch worlds are completely different. In general, there are actually more distinct glitch levels, and they are a bit more interesting than the original NES version. Here's that big table of levels for this release of the game, and here are the levels you would be able to access via the tennis glitch, if you can manage to hot swap a cartridge while the disk system is connected. You can also check a link in the description of this video that has maps of all of the levels just like I did for the other version of the game. My favorite is level with ID hex 5F, which is an underground version of the second half of level 3-3, but in a low tunnel. Too bad it's an auto-scrolling level. Interestingly, and probably why most people asked about this version, since the glitch world indices are different, that means world 36 is different, which means the minus world leads to different levels in this game. If we check that table, we see that level 36 now leads us to level ID 9, which is a water version of level 5-3. We can actually reach the flagpole in this level, so if we beat this level, we just march on to the next level ID in the list, which is ID hex 27. This is just level 7-3 with no changes, so this level is easily beatable as well. The next level ID is hex 44, which is an underground version of level 4-4. This level is also beatable since we can reach the axe. If you touch the axe in any world that is 8 or greater, the game treats it as, well, beating the game. Since we're in world 36, that satisfies that condition, and when we finish this level, we are booted back to the title screen and can even choose what world to start on. Speaking of the disk system, what about lost levels? Since this is a brand new game and not just a port, a lot of things are different. First, let's take a look at the list of level data pointers. My first observation is that unlike in SMB1, where the tile data and sprite data level types are in a different order, they're in the same order here. This means for any glitch levels that are just a normal level with a different type, they actually have the proper enemies. My second observation is that the level pointers are stored in a single table of 16-bit pointers instead of 2 tables of bytes like before. This doesn't really change anything, but it is interesting to note. And third, while looking at the big table of levels, I noticed that they are sort of in order this time, instead of being in a seemingly random order, which is nice. But here's an interesting thing about this table. If you look carefully at this tiny text, it says that the tile data for level 4-3 is located at address hex CFBF, and that the tile data for level 8-3 is at address CFB6. Level 8-3 is definitely longer than 9 bytes, so what's going on? Well, it has to do with the disk files. There are 4 files that correspond to program RAM on the Lost Levels disk. The main file, containing most of the game's code, including level data for worlds 1 through 4. The second file, containing level data for worlds 5 through 8. The third file, containing level data for world 9 and the sound engine for playing the ending theme. And the fourth file, containing level data for worlds A through D. The level data pointer has to account for each of the different files that could be loaded at a time. If, for example, you try to load level 5-1 when the first file is loaded, this would result in a glitch level. This means that each level ID can correspond to 4 different levels, depending on which file is currently loaded. If you look carefully, you'll notice that levels in worlds A through D aren't even in this table at all. That's because when the fourth file is loaded, an entirely new level data table is used instead, which includes only levels from worlds A through D. Worlds A through D are just worlds 1 through 4 in disguise, reading from a different table. Theoretically, this could mean that each level ID corresponds to 8 levels, 4 for each file, times 2 for the number of level tables. But since the second level table is located within the fourth file and overwrites the one from the first file, it's literally impossible to cross-reference these two. Unfortunately, there is a sad thing I have to report, and that is the way we used to access glitch levels in Super Mario Bros. 1 doesn't work anymore. When you game over in this game, there is a continue option right there, which starts you at the beginning of the world you were on. This means the method of saving the world you were on over a reset wasn't necessary any longer. Besides that, the game also constantly checks the current world number, and if it's greater than 9, it resets immediately. So even if you could glitch the world number to something out of bounds, you would be presented with the title screen again. It's almost like Nintendo knew about this bug and decided to squash it completely. With regards to the level format, not much changed other than adding a few new objects. First, the Mushroom Special Platform was replaced with the Big Long Cloud Special Platform. In the Standard Objects list, the Poison Mushroom question block, Invisible block, and Brick were added, as well as an Invisible block with a Fire Flower. Frustratingly, these new objects were inserted into the list at various locations instead of appending them to the end, which means the level loading routine is no longer backwards compatible with the level data from Super Mario Bros. 1. Objects to start and stop the wind were added at the end of objects with Y position 13. Upside down pipe objects were added at the end of the objects with Y position 15. Since the Y position has to be hard-coded here, one starts at Y position 2 and one starts at Y position 5. The code that handles the wind and upside down pipes is actually not present in the first file, since that memory location is taken up by the title screen data. This is probably why you are immediately presented with a level with both of these objects, right after the loading period before level 5-1. Piranha plants are just hard-coded to always be red at World 4 and beyond, and springboards are hard-coded to only be green on Worlds 2 or B, 3 or C, and 7. One last thing to point out about this game is that it has a lot more pipe transitions and sublevels, so a lot of the level's sublevels are just located in the same level beyond the flagpole, like in level 7-1. What about Super Mario All-Stars on the Super NES? Since the CPU in the SNES can easily run code written for the NES, this game was mainly a straight-up port of the NES version. The only things that really had to be changed were the interfaces between the SNES's graphics and sound systems. The level loading routine is pretty much the same, though there were a few more objects added in castle levels to make them look a bit more unique. Most of the fully glitched levels now crash the game entirely, other than this one, which is level ID hex 6A. Other glitch levels, like our old friend 9-1, still load though. The warp zone was fixed, and it now takes you to the proper world if you enter a pipe before the text appears. And even if you hack in a pipe at the end of level 4-2, it just takes you back to world 1. Boring. However, what wasn't patched was... How does the 4-2 wrong warp work? There are two level transition objects in near proximity of one another. The vine in this block should take you to the warp zone, while this pipe should take you to a coin cache. The first level transition object that corresponds to the vine can be placed anywhere before the vine appears, which it is, way back here. The second level transition object should ideally load in completely after the vine leaves the left side of the screen, but completely before the pipe enters the right side of the screen. Unfortunately, the object is placed way too late in the level, and so the transition for the vine persists for a while after it is gone. When Mario is positioned in the center of the screen like normal, this actually has no ill effect, since the transition loads in right about here, just before Mario makes it to the pipe. However, if Mario is anywhere near the right side of the screen, which you can do in several different ways, you can get into the pipe before that object loads. If the level transition object were placed anywhere within this range, it would load completely after the vine leaves and before the pipe appears, which would have prevented this wrong warp from happening. Finally, how do looping levels work? The level data only consists of checkpoints for the level looping routine to react to. Each checkpoint has a hard-coded screen number and vertical position associated with it. When they are loaded and the corresponding screen number is reached, the game checks Mario's vertical position, and if it doesn't exactly match that of the checkpoint, the level will loop. If it does match, the level will not loop. To make the level always loop, like in 8-4, the vertical position is set to hex F0, which is below the bottom of the screen, so Mario can never clear the checkpoint. By default, the checkpoints are single flags, except for World 7, which is hard-coded to treat the checkpoints as triplets. If Mario fails a checkpoint, or at the third checkpoint of a triplet, he fails at least one of the three, he will be sent backwards in the level exactly 4 screens, or 64 blocks. This is the one case where the game does go backwards in the level data, but it does so in a very rudimentary way. Each of the checkpoints, or triplet, has a hard-coded offset within the level tile data to jump back to upon failing the checkpoint. Everything that was already on the screen at the moment of the warp backwards will stay on screen, and only the new level data will show up properly. As for sprites, the offset is just set to 0, the start of the sprite data. The part of the level loading routine responsible for sprites will immediately scan forward past all of the sprites at the beginning of the level and stop at the proper next sprite with respect to the new position in the level. Additionally, all enemies currently on the screen will be unloaded instantly, which is why things like the fire bars and Bowser's fireballs seem to vanish into thin air. It's pretty ugly, but it works. And this should finally mark the end of the Super Mario Bros. Glitch levels and level format series of videos. Don't forget to check the video description for links to the glitch level maps, as well as the unlisted video showing off all of the levels being loaded, in case you missed that one. You can also find a link to a Patreon page if you would like to help support the channel. I do have plans to expand a little bit with content in 2023, so any and all help would be grateful. And lastly, you can find a link to the RGME Discord server where you can chat with other people who are interested in retro games and programming. Thank you for watching.